Hello and welcome to this latest episode of iLoop, and my guest today is Paul Babin. Paul spent almost 4 decades in Hollywood as one of its most respected cinematographers. He's worked with names such as Steven Spielberg, Peter Weir and James Cameron on films including Always, The Rainmaker and Fearless. In 2012, Paul was given the Lifetime Achievement Award for his cinematography, but something changed for him and he changed direction quite significantly. And today he is a life and leadership coach. He works with people who want to enhance the quality of their life and work. He also has a YouTube channel called The Abundance. I learned a great deal from this conversation, and for me, it's come at a very timely moment. And I will share with you my key takeaway from our conversation right at the end of this podcast episode. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoy, and thank you once again for listening and for your support. So, Paul, welcome. I'm so happy to have you here with me today.
Thank you.
And you have been in Hollywood for many, many years. I think, was it 40 years or something? You've had a long career in Hollywood as a cinematographer, but what you do now is really very different to
Mm.
those days of, rubbing shoulders with some very famous people. So can you tell us what it was that led to that change? Was there a particular trigger in your life that made you think that you needed to live a different way?
I found that I was more introspective than most of my colleagues. Um, I tended to isolate, which is a symptom of my psychology. I found uh, that I was affected emotionally by very often the chaos that some groups of people created. Each crew was a different experience, a completely different dynamic. Um, so, in many ways, I always felt like a bit of an outsider. The hours were a very punishing. Um, the assignments often kept me away from my family, um, and ultimately, the creative engagement for me was not enough. I never quite felt like I was living up to my potential.
Mm.
Um, all of those factors combined, um, so that about 10 years before I finally did get out of that career, the universe began to deliver the message to get out by by making the experiences less and less tolerable. Um, so you could say I went out with a bit of a whimper rather than a bang.
So
And at the
then,
same time, I was given a lifetime achievement award on the way out the door. So there you go.
yeah. So that's probably, a lot of people will resonate with that, we have this feeling that something's not quite working for us, but we don't really know what is out there that we can do, especially if you've been doing the same thing for such a long time. I can imagine it's not clear cut what you would do if you weren't doing that. So
Right.
did you have those kind of doubts as well about what you would do next if you left?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I was making a handsome salary that was supporting a family of four. Um, that was a very fearful prospect to walk away from that.
Yeah.
And I did attempt to change my position within the industry. I made on more than one occasion an attempt to become a director, but I had limiting beliefs that consistently would step in and pull the reins on that process.
So tell us a bit more about what was it then that was there kind of a particular event that made you decide once and for all that this wasn't right for you, or was it still a little bit more of a thoughtful process?
I wouldn't say there was any one event. Again, toward the end of my career, I was getting fired. I was fired 2 movies in a row, for example.
How did that
And
happen? What happened?
I was put together with a supervisor on both occasions who it was their role apparently in my life to get me to question my abilities
Mm.
and conclude that I had lost something. The second the second fellow literally convinced me that I had lost some of my ability in part of his insane kind of way of ushering me out the door. I think from their perspective, both of them on some level were intimidated by me. On some level, I was triggering them. God knows. From over here, it felt like I'd been put together with 2 crazy people. So that by the time I was fired from the second one and I went on to the next movie, I really entered that experience believing that I needed to hide the fact that that I was not competent.
Mm.
And it was a very distinct moment when, on that third movie, I had wound up sitting next to the director doing a shot from the film. It was Memoirs of a Geisha. And at the end of the shot, the director turned to me and said, "I'm so grateful to have you on this film. Your contributions have just been magnificent." It was almost an offhand remark. And he walked away. And suddenly, it literally felt like 500 pounds of judgment were lifted off my shoulders. The torture I'd put myself through on a conscious and unconscious level,
Yeah.
you know?
It's such an example of how, who you work with, the ecosystem you're in can completely change how you feel about yourself. And even if you are really good at what you do, it can be one or two people who can make you feel really doubt yourself. I mean, for
Right.
someone like you who'd been doing it for such a long time, for
Yeah.
you to feel that way, it must have been very debilitating.
It was. And if I only had the skill that I would learn 10, 12 years later of of acceptance. Okay, so this has happened. What might this be telling me about my relationship with myself on a psychological level?
Mm.
What what might the universe be trying to convey to me? Am I on some level um, ignoring myself or uh, denying certain aspects of who I really am? Am I putting myself through this kind of abuse on an unconscious level?
Yeah. And now, when you look back at that, do you feel that that was meant to be, and that you needed those people to kind of give you that push, perhaps that you didn't have within you to decide on?
I've really come to accept,
Yeah.
until I learn otherwise, that all of life, what happens around us, is a reflection of what's going on in terms of my relationship with myself.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
Paul, you also mentioned earlier that, the hours were very long. It was very difficult on your personal life. And so what did all of this do for your family life?
It created a great deal of resentment with my wife. Um, it it um, it created a separation that was already there. It exacerbated that, especially if it was a situation where I would be out of town for um, more than a few days. I'd return, and it would be a very difficult reentry. Certainly, there were times when it would have been better for my children had I been there.
Yeah.
You know.
So tell us more about what happened next for you.
Yeah. So ultimately, my marriage, which was not healthy, ended with a bang. This basically coincided with my children leaving the nest, and I found myself in an interesting position of being cut loose. It was a combination of abject fear of financial insecurity, and at the same time a tremendous sense of liberation, of being set free, of being cut loose from a really unhealthy situation that I certainly was a contributor to.
So you had been married for how long when you got divorced?
25 years.
Gosh, that's a long time.
Yeah.
So it was a bit of a shock to your system to have to leave the family home. So how did you deal with that? Because emotionally that would have been quite a frightening time for you.
It was. It also coincided with the 2000. It's all occurred right in sync with the 2008 recession. Um, the answer is I held on and rode it. Um, it was an interesting experience in retrospect of watching the universe step in and care for me. One of the first things that happened within days of leaving my home is I was snatched up by a television series that kept me employed very handsomely for the next 2.5 years. Took me through the divorce, took me through the financial strain of paying alimony, allowed me to afford a an apartment to live in that was not a rat infested hovel. Um, it got me through it on a financial level. It also became a time in which I felt a deeper connection with the great whatever, the universe, God, higher power, and recognized in a moment of epiphany that this was a turning point in my life, that I could continue living out the patterns I had that had helped contribute to this painful, dysfunctional relationship, or I could make some changes.
Had you been religious before then, or was this something new?
No, I had been spiritual.
Mm.
I had at the age of 32, 20 plus years prior to this, um, confronted an addiction I had, and in the course of healing that addiction, working with that addiction, I was advised to begin to develop a spiritual life, something I had consciously avoided. I had called myself an atheist. So I said, okay, I was willing to try. So to some extent I had, and this life-changing event, the divorce, really became a time of deepening that,
Yeah.
the beginning of a deepening of that. Yeah.
So you felt supported by the universe because you found this job that paid you really well, and then so at this point you were still doing the sort of thing you were doing before, which is
Yes. Yes.
staying in media.
Yeah. I began working with a therapist pretty intensively.
Mm.
I began attending 12-step meetings again regularly. I got a sponsor. I worked with the 12 steps, which are which is a spiritual program. And it was quite remarkable because I began to attract people into my life who were very different from what I had typically found in my life. I found like-minded people who were curious and um, and had some sense of a spiritual connection to this lifetime, and were curious as I was, and sensitive and creative, and a delight to be around.
And were
You
these
know,
people you met through the 12-step program or just generally?
it was a variety of places. No particular no particular pattern to
Mm.
that. You know,
And I'm,
ultimately I began to date. You know, for the
mm,
first time in a very long time, and so some of it came from that process. Ultimately, led to meeting my wife, my
yeah,
present wife. So
yeah. So
yeah,
tell us about that. How did you meet her? Where did you meet her?
through a dating site.
So you went to a therapist to really get, you know, what was the kind of, is it the emotional trauma of the divorce that you were trying to deal with, or was it something deeper that you felt had contributed to your failed marriage?
I recognized that I had a pattern of behavior that was not conducive to healthy, loving relationships. Some of it was addictive behavior,
Yeah.
and I um, and I wanted to break that pattern. And and this therapist that I began to see suddenly opened my eyes to this concept of codependency. Became aware of my codependent nature. I became aware of the fact that I had been married to a codependent. She had been a narcissistic codependent, which is someone who is only happy when everyone around them is doing what she needs them to do. And I was a codependent on the other end of the scale. If anybody around me was upset, it disturbed me. I would take responsibility for the emotional well-being of the people around me.
Yeah.
So you put the two of us together, and we were just dynamite. We were we were we were very challenged.
Yeah.
You
So I
know.
have a question on that, Paul, because
Yeah.
that sounds like a lot of people who are very, empathetic and kind and caring. That sounds like the kind of person who just, looks after people in their family, their friends, and maybe puts themselves right at the bottom of every priority list.
Uh-huh.
Is that the definition of codependency, or is that just
No, codependency is when you stake your value, your worthiness on how other people are behaving.
right?
No, I consider myself very empathetic, and I value that quality, and I'm grateful that I have it. I'm grateful to have the sensitivity that I do in regard to other people and their well-being. The trouble comes in when I let my my feelings about my worthiness and lovability hinge on how other people are reacting.
Yes, yes. And is it also about, the affirmation that you have done well or you have contributed to their well-being that also helps to feel like you're worthy? Is that also an aspect of codependency?
Um, Only to the extent that I mean, I love affirmations from people. I love it when people say, "Oh, you know, your meditation was so helpful," or "Your work with me as a coach was so helpful." I'm grateful for that. It's when I become insecure, become upset if someone uh, has a negative experience that's somehow connected to me.
Yes, I can so resonate with that. I think I probably have traits. I probably have those traits
We
myself.
all do to some degree. We
Yes.
all do. And, you know, and these are created in childhood
Yeah.
when it's a matter of survival, keeping very often keeping my parents happy. You know, oh my gosh, if I do that thing, if I behave that way, they get upset. Um, that's fine, but it's when we come to the conclusion, if I am simply being myself, if I'm doing that thing that I love to do, that's very natural and is just simply who I am, and that gets them upset, well, then I have to shut down that part of myself.
Yeah.
That's when it gets unhealthy.
Yes, I see that.
And very often comes out later in life when we feel dead inside because we've closed the door on that aspect of ourselves, so
Yeah.
to speak.
So you discovered that trait about yourself sort of in your 50s.
Yes, yeah.
And was how easy or difficult is it to change after such a long time of being that way?
Um, it at that point relatively easy, I would say. Um, this at the same time, this therapist introduced me to this tool called inner child work,
Mm.
and this was one way to understand and heal my codependency, to be able to um, picture this aspect of myself that held the was the seat of self-doubt,
Yeah.
that was the seat of insecurity and unhappiness as a small child within me, and to reparent that part of myself.
And for a lot of people who, I've talked about this to some of the people I work with,
Mm.
it's hard for them to get their heads around how it actually works in practice. How would they actually do it? So, can you give us an example of the kind of thing you would do with yourself to address your inner child and make them feel heard and
Yeah.
understood?
So one of the tools is to have a photograph of myself as a child and myself as an adult, and I would have those in front of me, get quiet, drop into my heart space, imagining that was where my inner child lived, and begin to have a conversation
Mhm.
from the aspect of a loving adult, a loving adult who is trying to get to know and understand and serve this child who has been abandoned for a long time. So a lot of it is just asking questions, um, getting learning is a priority. You know, tell me what's going on with you, tell me what you're thinking, tell me what you're feeling, tell me the conclusions you're coming to, tell me about what you believe to be true, and then from the perspective of this loving administrative adult, to relieve this child of these beliefs, these burdens, and give that child permission to go back to being a child, and to let go of the responsibilities and all that was going on in the adult world, you know.
And is that something that you would do on a regular basis, or is
Yes,
it triggered
yeah,
by
daily,
yeah, daily?
daily, sometimes a couple times in a day. And sometimes I would write out these dialogues, sometimes I would speak them into my iPhone on the way to work.
And how did that help you doing
It
that?
it it allowed me to put out the fires of insecurity, to detach from my codependent nature in dealing with other people, to stand up for myself, to create boundaries, to make rules, to make agreements that were self-honoring, and 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 it freed up this aspect of myself, this childlike aspect of myself, which is intimately connected with my creative life. Once he was free of worrying about what was going to happen when we got to work with that crazy person, once he was free of that responsibility, he had all this time and space to devote to creative efforts. So, so my creative life really kicked in a big way, and I began to get really active in lots of different ways at this stage of my life.
So what kind of things did you do?
I finally began to weld. I'd always wanted to weld.
Oh,
I did that for a while. I made metal sculptures. Um, I began to write songs for the first time in my life. I began to take singing lessons. This led ultimately to my creating an album of my songs, for God's sake. Completely not on the radar, you know, prior to the divorce.
and of course you have your YouTube channel, and that's how you and I connected. It feels like a long time ago, but
Yeah,
your meditation videos were absolutely beautiful. So
right.
was that around the time that you went into that space as well, or did that come later?
That came a little later, after I went to school and got my degree in spiritual psychology,
Right.
and then did some further study um, at the University of Santa Monica. One of the textbooks was by Joe Dispenza, and in the back was a meditation of his. And he said in the book, "Go ahead and record a version of this. Put some soft music behind it, and you can meditate to it," which I did, and I put it on YouTube to share with my classmates. And this was the first time that I became aware of people responding to the sound of my voice.
Yeah, I remember that.
Um,
Mm.
Within a year, this meditation had um, close to 1 million views. And there was all this feedback, all this positive feedback about how it worked for them, completely unplanned.
Is it still on YouTube or?
No, no, Mr. Dispenza's publishers asked me to please take it off
Oh,
when, when it had accumulated so many viewers, which I did. And and it was interesting because I now had 10,000 subscribers, yearning for something to take its place, and so I was called on to create my own,
yeah.
which I've been doing since.
So you also create music, because you said the sort of music behind the meditation was also your own composition,
Yeah.
wasn't it?
Yes.
So was that always on the cards? Were you always musical before?
Um, I dabbled in music, starting as a teenager. I was one of those people fortunate enough to see the Beatles um, on the Ed Sullivan Show as a young boy. I remember the hair on my arms literally raising up. It was the most electrifying experience I think I had in my life.
Mhm.
So suddenly the prospect of music, um, but it really up leveled when this change happened in my life, when I was cut free and began to work on myself and free myself from limitations.
It's such an interesting, it's an interesting example of how, when you have that sort of break from something you've known for such a long time and that's become your comfort zone. And, you're probably not very comfortable in that comfort zone anymore, but the outside of that comfort zone just seems so scary that you stay in it longer than maybe you should. And here you were cut loose, as you put it. Scary, but also
It's
liberated.
terrifying. Yeah.
And I think, people can go one way or the other. Some people might sort of fall into a trap of, wallowing in their fear and self-pity. And And you didn't do that, and you took ownership of your situation, and you discovered this whole new way of being. You mentioned
Yeah.
you did spiritual psychology. What led you to down that path? Because it seems very different to, the creative stuff that you were doing before.
Yeah. Um, I met the woman who is now my wife, Vicky,
You'd met her by this time.
and she described having gone to this university and gotten a degree in spiritual psychology. Well, that sounded interesting. And shortly after we met, she gifted me with a book by Dr. Ron Hulnick, who with his wife Mary Hulnick are the driving force behind spiritual psychology. A book called Loyalty to Your Soul, which I just gobbled up. I just, wow, I just so get this. I so understand this. I so resonate with this approach to psychology and the blend of spiritual um, suggestions. It just made sense to me. Um, Went to one of their orientation evenings and signed up to to get a master's degree. It was really quite simple and sensible at the time. You know,
Oh,
we're
were you
ready
still
when we're ready.
working? Were you still working? Was this a part-time thing, or was it full time?
It was my work was dropping off a lot.
And so what happened next? So you went in to do this course. Was it a 2-year course or 1 year?
Yeah, it was a 2-year course.
Yeah.
And in the and in doing it was highly experiential, and the experience was focused on self therapy, on using the tools and practices, principles and practices they taught in in um, in dealing with my own limiting beliefs,
Hmm.
in what they called the rocks in my backpack, and removing those rocks.
And so what happened next? So at this point, did you know what you were going to do with that master's degree?
Hadn't a clue.
Did you have a plan?
Had not a clue. Um, wasn't even aware there was such a thing as an occupation called life coach. But having gotten the master's degree, oh, they also have a 6 month life coach certification program. Okay, let's go do that. Which very much felt like the third year of the master's degree program. Again, highly experiential. Again, digging deeply into my psychological um, I was going to say minefield, but that's a little negative. But it gave me the opportunity to more deeply work on my own issues. Again, highly transformative. And at the end of that, I realized from having practiced it in the course, I realized I had the ability to help people.
Hmm.
You know, using using again uh, principles and practices, tools of spiritual psychology. Among them, the powerful tool of listening.
Yes. And I can attest to that because you've been my coach.
Well,
And it was such a wonderful experience for me. But I think very often people who go into that sort of journey and they decide that they have gone through an experience and they have come out the other end, they've helped themselves, and they feel now they are ready to take what they've learned and help others. Was it an element of that? Did you feel that the things that you were struggling with, that you saw others and you thought, well, I can help you? Or was it, I mean, I'm interested to know how you went from studying and doing this to now actually actively going out there and helping people.
I think that the wonderful, joyful experience of helping people recognize in themselves stuff that I struggled with,
Mm,
like codependency.
yeah.
Um, to to literally help them remove some of the rocks from their backpack, to come to an awareness of, oh my gosh, I've been doing this to myself for so long. That means I can change it, you know, and experiencing others' success was such a that in itself was a spiritual experience for me. That was so affirmative. That was the universe. That was God saying, "Yes, dude. Now you're on. Now you're on track. Now you're doing the important work."
Yeah. And did your long sort of illustrious career in Hollywood help you at all in this new career as a life coach?
Sure, sure. I'm able to look, as I was saying earlier, at these. Every time a film gets made, a new family is created of people working on this project. Um, a highly creative endeavor, um, with parental figures, at the helm, who range in their ability to lead all over the place, um, and a family that can be very childlike, trying to serve these adults, uh,
Mm.
um, and all of that, um, dovetailing into whatever this creative energy is that has such a powerful influence on any artistic endeavor. Um, so that mix to me was always fascinating. The just the range of possible experiences. There were two or three occasions in my career in which we I would work with a director who was, for lack of a better word, spiritual, who had qualities of serenity and empathy and um, authenticity that 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 just leaked out to the rest of us, and created a very safe kind of environment in which the creative things happened that were just joyful. And then there was the other extreme.
And does that
Um,
actually show in the end product? Because obviously we as consumers, we don't know what drama occurred behind the scenes, but from your experience, when you look at all the different films, maybe you could, mention some of the big films that you've been part of, do you see a film and you think, yeah, this is amazing because we had this wonderful person at the top of the
I,
family?
I think so,
Hmm.
but the experience of a film is a very individual thing. We all bring our experience to those 2 hours in the dark. You and I can sit down and watch the same movie, and I have one experience and you have another. Because it's kicking up all this unconscious material, and so it's very challenging for me to say yes or no to that.
Yeah.
I think so. The most spiritual experience I had in making a film was a movie called Fearless, directed by Peter Weir, starring Jeff Bridges, which is an unusual film, as are several of Peter Weir's films. Um, I don't know. I leave it up to your viewers to decide. Um, another interesting, wonderful, soulful experience of creating a movie was K-Pax. I think it conveys some of that wonderful, magical, spiritual quality.
And do you feel, I mean, you mentioned that you hadn't heard about life coaching, so clearly life coaching or coaching in any shape or form wasn't necessarily accessible to people in the industry when you were in it. Has that changed at all? I mean, do you find that you're getting clients from the film industry who could do with your, your kind of support and help in dealing with these high octane,
Yeah.
personalities.
Yes. Yes. Several of my clients are actively working in the industry and enjoy and appreciate the fact that I've had many of the experiences that they're going through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to also just ask you about, your wife, who you met and who changed everything for you. And we often know how important our relationships are in allowing us to be who we are. So how did you, I mean, having come from a long and, not always happy marriage, how did you know that she was the one for you? Was there something that you'd learned by yourself that helped you do that, or was it something else?
Honestly, there was a God moment for me when we dated off and on for a year. I was not ready to commit to a monogamous relationship with her. This was 3, 4 years after my divorce. We'd date for a few weeks, and then she'd say, I'm getting drawn in. My heart is getting drawn into this. I need to break it off." And she'd go away, and then somehow we'd get back together again for another couple of months. I would continue to date other people openly because this was about to happen for the fourth time. She said, "This is it. I'm. It's too painful for me. I adore you. Um, if you want to commit to me, I would appreciate that, but I need to move on." And in that moment, the universe said, "Hey, do this. Yes, it's scary, but that's an indication that you need to do it. This is going to stretch you."
Yeah.
So I said, "Okay, I'm ready." And what I found is that I had someone who accepted me for who I was. She loved who I was as opposed to what I could be for her. She was not out to change me. And it's just been um, extraordinary.
That's so
Yeah.
lovely. And I
Yeah.
want to ask you about, you mentioned earlier that you were an atheist, you didn't really believe in God, and yet you seem to now completely, embody what it is to be a spiritual person. Um, I come across people who find it very, very hard to separate spirituality from religion, and, the whole idea of believing in something that has no evidence behind it, there's no scientific basis, seems really anathema to them, and they find it very hard to do that. So, can you help me understand how you did it, and how you help people to do that in your work,
Yeah.
if you do, if you can help them?
Well, a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, the experience of God is highly personal and is different for everyone. Secondly, it can't be described with words.
Mm,
But the only word that comes close to describing my notion of God is the word yes. In that my experiences of higher power uh, very often bring with it a sense of already knowing this. It's like, oh yes, I understand this on some deep, deep level. It's a confirmation of something.
mm,
Um, we're highly programmed by our culture, by our upbringing, by our parents' attitudes and beliefs, uh, to 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 have a picture of God my calling myself an atheist was strictly because my father called himself an atheist, and he would bellow self-righteously for most of his adult life, largely critiquing organized religion with good reason. There's extraordinary pain and suffering that has come down throughout history from organized religion, and I don't align with any religion, but I recognize that I've had experiences in my life, throughout my life, that could be called fate, and I encourage people to use the word fate if they're uncomfortable with God, or use an expression like that's just the way life kind of works, you know. Um, but I recognized that I had many experiences in my life where fate stepped in a fascinating way to take me in a direction that ultimately brought me here.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of a moment when the penny suddenly dropped and you think, yeah, this is what it is to feel in the presence of God or
Yeah,
spirit?
well, again, I had it that night that Vicky called me on the phone and said, "Look, I'm ready to commit to this relationship. Um, are you?"
Mm,
And in that moment, there was a sense of this is the right thing to do,
yeah,
in spite of the discomfort.
yeah.
That was one of those moments. Um, I think back to my drinking and drug use days, in which I engaged in behavior that should have killed me, literally. I took risks that actuaries would have said, "Nope, he's a goner," but I survived. Other circumstances in which I made a decision suddenly based on little or no evidence, but with a sense of knowing that took me in the direction I was supposed to go. Those are God. Those are experiences of God. Those are experiences of spirit, or whatever this thing is that I continue to work at understanding and hearing and connecting with, and um, sharing sharing the burden that my brain makes up as a burden called life. Yeah.
So how do you deal with dark days, or when you're going through a difficult time or emotional upheaval? How do you deal with it now?
Well, first thing I do is acceptance. Okay, so this is happening. Spiritual psychology has taught me that every time I get upset, school's in session. It is an opportunity to go deep and explore the upset.
I love
And
that.
and very often, through a process that I've learned, I can burrow down and recognize one of two or three very basic judgments at play. And they're I am statements. I am unworthy. I am unlovable. I'm not good enough. Those are the big three. Tend to be behind every upset that ever crosses my path.
Mm,
And when I get clarity about that, I then take a moment of self forgiveness. I'm sorry I told myself yet again, for the umpteenth time, that I'm not worthy, because that's not true. See, it's not true that I'm not enough. And I have lots of evidence to support that in my life. So I'm sorry I did that to myself again. Maybe I'll connect with my inner child, because lots of times that's him calling out to me. And then that allows me to move on. And moving on may involve another 12, 15, 24 hours of not feeling very good. So be it. That's just the way it is.
yeah. And that's such an important thing, and it's allowing yourself to sit with whatever that feeling is and not feel like you have to move on, you have to be positive, and you gotta
Right.
be, putting on a brave face. That's
Right.
hard to do, isn't it? That's hard for
We're,
people to do.
we're not, most of us are not taught that it's okay.
Yeah.
Most of us are not taught um, to recognize what we're feeling. Too many of us are told as children to stop crying. Too many of us are told in one way or another, don't feel that, or stop feeling that way.
Yeah.
It's not often that a parent pauses and allows and helps the child recognize what they're feeling in a given moment.
Yeah.
And we grow to adults as, in a state of kind of vague confusion about what we're feeling, much less the origins. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a couple more questions, Paul,
Yeah.
before we wrap up. In this new career as a coach and, putting out some really wonderful creative stuff out there, is there one thing that you can point to that you're particularly proud of or feel like, that it's an embodiment of your creativity or the things that you've learned?
Yeah. A recent client is a woman who is a camera operator in the motion picture business. Now, the motion picture business was, when I was in it, and I imagine still is, one of the most sexist industries on the planet. When I was there, women were confined on the set to primarily makeup and hair. Occasionally, a script supervisor would be female, but the majority of the crew tended to be macho kinds of guys, kind of like construction workers. And there was definitely a bias against females. So she's a camera operator, and is continually coming up against that bias in combination with her own self-doubt
Mm.
of being good enough. And after working with her, there was a very fulfilling moment where she came back to me and reported having been solid in her self-worth when confronted by a very insensitive male colleague. She did not collapse internally. She made it very clear that she was talented, capable, definitely worthy of being there, and was unaffected by his behavior. And not only that, was able to treat him in a loving way
Yeah.
because she was treating herself in a loving way.
And that is
She
such
got
a, sorry, go on.
she'd gotten to the point where she recognized what these guys triggered in her, the self-judgment she carried of not being good enough. And she got to the point where she was able to address that immediately and recognize, oh, I just told myself that again. He triggered that voice. It's not true. I forgive myself for doing that. Now, what did you need? You know. So that was a very fulfilling moment for me.
And I think what you said, I think what you said was that not only did she do that, but she was able to treat him just the same and not, because I think this is
Yeah.
obviously a very topical thing, and when women feel like they're being undermined or treated as, inferior, there is a temptation to kind of fight back and, to get really aggressive and like, and that doesn't.
To become male-like.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, and to push back,
yeah.
which may help temporarily, but it doesn't really solve anything. So what do you
Especially if th're being untrue to themselves. Yes.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
So from what you were saying about this client of yours, that she didn't do that. She was still
Right.
herself, but she just
Yeah.
didn't allow herself to feel less than just because of this person's insecurities.
Right. She connected with that internal part that had been triggered and was continually getting triggered, dealt with herself lovingly, and then was able to deal with him lovingly and demonstrated, here's the powerful part, I guess, now that I'm talking about it, demonstrated the power of love,
Yeah,
which is what we get to when we heal our issues. We can operate from a base of love, starting with ourselves, and then operating that way with the rest of the world. And love very often is setting boundaries, of saying, excuse me, that's not an appropriate way to treat me. Would you like to start over? Which is basically what she said to him.
yeah,
And uh, you know the effect that has on everyone, it can heal the planet. You know, it's um, it's almost a cliche, but it's true. The
yeah.
the, the Beatles were telling us. The Beatles were pointing the way. Love is all you need.
Absolutely.
Starting with myself.
Knowing yourself. Yeah.
Yeah.
So my final question for you, Paul, today is that what is your definition of a fulfilled life?
Definition of a fulfilled life for me is um, uncovering my unique gifts and talents and putting them to use to serve, to leave the planet a better place. That is to me the ultimate creative act. That to me is the ultimate life lived to its fullest.
That's great. This has been such a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much,
Oh, God
Paul.
bless.
And
Thank
love
you.
all the artwork at the back.
Uh,
Are they yours?
yeah,
They're
yeah,
all yours. Fantastic. And
yeah.
your musical instruments, I think it's so wonderful to see how it is possible to reinvent and, discover things about yourself, even after a long career like you had of 40 years. It gives so many people, it would give so many people hope that, you don't have to be defined by what you did for
Right.
a career
That's
for
right.
many, many years. So you can start again and you can create
Yeah,
something even more beautiful and amazing.
yeah. And we carry the guidebook within us. You know, it's I would suggest reinvent is be replaced with rediscover, because as children we're we are unbridled creative joy. It's only when we learn that there's something wrong that we're cast off on our journey to ultimately unlearn that
Yeah.
and get back to that beautiful child mind, that beautiful state of presence we have as kids, to get back to that creative being we were and somehow got talked out of, you know it, and that's, I mean, that's what's so beautiful about you and your hula hoops. It's so symbolic of getting back to that essential nature,
Yeah.
which I would suggest is divine. I that's another place where this whole God thing makes sense to me.
Mm.
that we're delivered onto the planet in this very divine, lovely, creative state. You know?
Yeah. Well,
And then
I
the journey
acknowledge
becomes coming
you.
back to it too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I completely, acknowledge. I think for me, having sort of worked with you and having had many conversations with you, the one thing that I took away that helps me even today is the inner child work.
Mm,
To be loving towards the child in me, and that is so critical to change how you are, whether it's self-love, it's self-care, it's,
yeah.
self-belief. The minute you look at yourself as this child, and if you have children, as most people our age do, it's very
Yeah.
easy to see that you would never treat a child in the way you are treating your own child. And
That's
when that
right.
light bulb goes off in your head, you can change the way you are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It's just a matter of unlearning, of replacing stories that we're carrying with the truth.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, one piece of advice for somebody who's listening who may be going through a bit of turmoil or, experiencing change and doesn't know what to do, what's one thing that they can begin with to make that
Every,
change?
everything you want is on the other side of fear.
Yeah.
I can't take credit for that, but it's one of the aphorisms that just so resonates with me. And it's okay to feel fear.
Mm.
That's the survival part of our brain that hates change.
Yeah.
You know, this this experience that we've been talking about, my divorce, was so filled with fear. Um, but indeed, everything I really wanted was on the other side of it. So
Thank you so much, Paul, for your
yeah.
time and your
Oh, thank
wisdom.
you, thank you. I enjoyed this, and I so acknowledge your work and your curiosity and your being.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rohini.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I particularly love how calm and soothing Paul is when he speaks. His tone is so measured and so thoughtful. And for me, I suppose the key takeaway is the inner child work. And, in one of my previous podcast episodes with Kuljit Semi, we talked about the inner child work that she did. And I felt that today's conversation really brought out in a lot more detail how we can all do that for ourselves, and how by doing that we can live our lives really being who we are, true to ourselves, being authentic, but also being loving, not just to ourselves, but to the people around us. I'm always interested to hear what you, my listeners, have thought of this particular episode, what your takeaway has been. If you would like to tell me, then you can email me on info@rohini-rator.co.uk. Also, let me know how we can make this podcast more interesting and useful for you. And finally, I want to acknowledge Mike Pearl for his musical contribution at the bookends of this podcast. If you are interested in getting Mike to create some music for you, you can get in touch with him direct. His email address is mp, that's M for Mike, P for Pearl, so mp969696 at hotmail.com. Thank you for joining me.